Welcome back. This is the recording for Biology 2225 Lab at CNM. This week's topic is abdominal circulation. The images for this particular topic can be found in Chapter 20 all the way back in the blood vessel chapter. Okay, before we talk about any specific blood vessels of the body in this lab this week, I want to just refresh your memory on what a portal circulation is. Remember, a portal circuit is a circulatory pathway that's different from the normal pathway. Remember, the normal pathway is an artery, serves a capillary bed, is drained into a vein and back to the heart. Remember, in a portal system, we've got an artery serving a capillary bed, and then instead of going right back to the heart, the blood is collected from that first capillary bed and goes to a second capillary bed. And only then does the blood return back to the heart. I remind you of this because several of the blood vessels that we look at today in this topic are involved in a portal circulation. Remember, there are three portal systems in the body that we talked about in lecture. And the main one, the biggest one, is the one that involves the abdominal organs and the liver. As we mentioned last week, one of the liver's jobs is to cleanse the blood coming from these other organs. So we have a portal system, and I just want to point that out, that several of the veins, especially that we're going to be looking at, will be involved in a portal circulation. All right, so how do we approach this? I think it's best to approach this topic the same way we approached blood vessels earlier in the term. I think the best thing to do is to have a roadmap in your head and then use that roadmap as you look at pictures or models and apply what you know to those pictures and models. And so my recommendation again is that you be able to draw a diagram like this from memory and have that in your head when you're looking at pictures and models for identification purposes. This particular picture, you'll notice this PowerPoint, by the way, is not exactly the PowerPoint that's listed for Chapter 20. I've modified it a bit. This particular hand drawing and the one for veins can be found in a folder in CNM Learn titled Abdominal Circulation. So you do have access to this hand drawing, even though it's not in the PowerPoint per se. At any rate, essentially this lists all of the arteries that we are responsible for. We start at the abdominal aorta, which is what we call the aorta once it pokes through the diaphragm coming out of the thoracic cavity. The very first major vessel we see is a single trunk known as the celiac trunk. This is not labeled here, but essentially this trunk right here is called the celiac trunk, and I might as well go ahead and add to this. So right there, this little basic trunk there is called the celiac trunk, and it gives rise to several vessels, the major ones of which we have listed in our list of terms. The three major vessels that come off the celiac trunk are the splenic artery, the left gastric artery, and the hepatic artery. The splenic artery, as you might guess, serves the spleen, but it also supplies blood to the pancreas along the way. The left gastric artery provides blood to a portion of the stomach, and the hepatic artery, again, as the name implies, is the major supply of blood to the liver. It also has a side branch that serves a portion of the stomach. So many of your higher or more superior abdominal organs are served through this celiac trunk. The next vessel down is usually just beneath the celiac trunk, another large trunk-like vessel known as the superior mesenteric artery. The superior mesenteric artery is a primary artery that serves the intestines. So the superior mesenteric artery serves the entire small intestine, the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, and it serves the majority of the colon. It serves the cecum, the ascending colon, the transverse colon, and the proximal portion of the descending colon. After that, we start to see some paired arteries. The first pair we see is a tiny pair of vessels known as the suprarenal arteries. The suprarenal arteries, once again, as the name logically implies, serve the adrenal glands. Suprarenal and adrenal basically being synonymous, both mean sitting on top of the kidneys. And so the suprarenal supply blood to the adrenal glands. Next, as we learned earlier in the semester, we have a pair of renal arteries. These are the blood vessels that supply the kidneys with their blood. And then after that, we have a pair of very fragile, very tiny little arteries known as the gonadal arteries. Now, you can be more specific in this. In males, we can call these the testicular arteries, and in females, we can call them the ovarian arteries. But if you want to just be generic about it, you can simply refer to them as the gonadal arteries. And then finally, the last major branch goes back to being a single trunk that comes off of the abdominal aorta, and this is known as the inferior mesenteric artery. The inferior mesenteric artery is going to supply blood to the rest of the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, and the rectum. And from there on out, we have a familiar pattern that we did earlier in this semester when we did the blood vessels of the lower extremities. The abdominal aorta splits into the common iliacs, and then we have the internal and external iliacs, and then so on down to the legs and the pelvic cavity. So that's the diagram that you want to be able to have, the pattern, the road map that you want to have in your head, and that will make it much easier when you look at a diagram or model of these vessels. The book provides you with a fairly nice diagram of all these vessels, and just to go through it again, we see the abdominal aorta poking through the diaphragm here, through this opening, through what's called the hiatus in the diaphragm. We have a celiac trunk right here, and that celiac trunk is going to give rise to various vessels that are not shown quite so clearly here, but I believe we'll see them more clearly in the next diagram. So we'll come back to the celiac trunk in just a bit. After the celiac trunk, we have the suprarenal arteries that supply blood to the adrenal glands. We have the superior mesenteric artery, again, the one supplying most of the intestines. And you'll notice the relationship between the superior mesenteric and the suprarenals is a little bit variable. In some people, the suprarenals are clearly above the superior mesenteric. In others, the superior mesenteric is clearly above the suprarenals. So as always, there's some variation in the exact location, but clearly these don't look anything alike. And of course, the suprarenals are tiny and paired, and the superior mesenteric artery is a single trunk. After that, we have the renal arteries clearly going out to the kidneys. Following that, we have gonadal arteries. I said earlier, they were very tiny and fragile. There's the right gonadal artery. This ends up being the left gonadal artery. And then as we continue on down, the last major trunk we have in our list of terms is the inferior mesenteric artery, serving that distal part of the large intestine. And that's it. Those are, again, the major vessels that we need to be able to identify for this week's lab. Now, clearly, there are other vessels coming off of the aorta, the lumbars and the median sacral and so on. But we're just, once again, looking at the major vessels, the major vessels of the abdomen. As I said earlier, I was hoping to get a clearer view of the celiac trunk, but we're not getting that. So we'll have to wait till the video on the models to show you the branches of the celiac trunk. There will be a second video following this one where I point out these vessels on our models. What this diagram shows, though, is the extensive pattern of blood supply by the superior mesenteric artery, the superior mesenteric artery. See how it branches, and its vessels travel through the mesenteries. That's why it's called the mesenteric artery. Remember, the mesenteries are double folds of peritoneum that help hold everything together in the abdomen. And so again, we supply the entire small intestine, the ascending colon and transverse colon. Now, in different books, you get a little bit different opinion in terms of how extensive the the supply of blood is by this superior mesenteric. This diagram seems to indicate that it cuts off somewhere around the ascending colon, but I've seen other books that say it does continue on and overlap with the inferior mesenteric through this curvature. So somewhere in this region is where the superior mesenteric ceases its supply of blood. And of course the rest of the colon, as we said, is picked up by the inferior mesenteric, which serves, again, the descending sigmoid, colon, and rectum. Okay, as for the veins, we see some similarities, but it's not totally symmetrical to what we saw in the arteries, and that is largely due to the portal circulation that we have to account for. So if we look at the, again, do a road map in your head, if you look at the main vessels, first of all, we're not dealing with the aorta anymore. Of course, now we're dealing with the inferior vena cava. And remember, blood flow in this case is coming into the vena cava and flowing up back to the heart through the diaphragm. What we see, the most superior branches that we see feeding into the inferior vena cava are the hepatic veins. There are several hepatic veins, and they come right out of the back of the liver, the posterior side of the liver, and drain the liver directly into the vena cava. These are often not shown on any of our models because they are relatively short, and you actually have to remove the liver in order to expose them. Again, the liver is going to sit right here on top of the vena cava. And so really these are often not seen on any models because again, you'd have to remove the liver to see them, and most models just don't do that. As we move down the right side, we see some familiar names: a suprarenal vein for the adrenal gland, a renal vein for the kidney, and a gonadal vein for the gonad, again, testicular or ovarian, depending. So these parallel the arteries that we looked at. But you'll notice the asymmetry here in venous drainage. On the left side, we have the same three vessels, the suprarenal, the renal, and the gonadal. But instead of draining directly into the inferior vena cava, note that the suprarenal and the gonadal will drain into the renal vein. And then all the blood from all those areas will collectively then drain through the renal vein into the inferior vena cava. I'm not 100% sure what the rationale is for this asymmetry. I do know that the inferior vena cava tends to sit towards the right side of the vertebral column, and so there is a little more distance between the vena cava and the left adrenal gland and the left kidney. And so maybe it's just a way to conserve materials. Instead of having three separate vessels traverse this extra length across the vertebral column, we drain them into a single larger vessel and have just a single vessel cross that extra distance. I don't know that for a fact. It's just a possible hypothesis. All right, and then again from there on out we have the familiar iliac pattern of external and internal. So you'll notice there's something missing here. There are several organs that we're not accounting for. For instance, where is the pancreas being drained? Where's the spleen drainage? Where's the drainage from the stomach? Where's the drainage from all the intestines? We don't see any of that in this basic pattern. Well, again, that's because those organs are involved in the portal circulation, which we see down here. So instead of the blood from those organs draining directly into the vena cava, the blood from those organs has to be sent to the liver first, where it's cleansed, and then from the liver, it will drain through the hepatic veins back into the mainstream circulation. So how do we drain those organs? Well, we have a splenic vein, which is coming over from the left. The splenic vein tends to pick up blood not only from the spleen, but also from the pancreas and from the stomach. So three organs tend to drain into the splenic vein: stomach, spleen, and pancreas. We have a superior mesenteric vein that parallels the superior mesenteric artery. This one is draining blood again out of the small intestine and the large intestine, at least through the transverse colon, sometimes through the curvature down into the descending colon as well. And then finally we have an inferior mesenteric vein that drains the the remainder of the colon and the rectum. And so all these vessels come together and produce a single vessel that's then going to supply blood to the liver so that the hepatocytes can work on this blood that might contain toxins or any other molecules from the digestive system that we want to control in terms of making it into the mainstream circulation. This vessel is known as the hepatic portal vein. The hepatic portal vein. This is the main vein that enters the liver and it's picking up blood from these three veins coming from these other organs. So this is all part of the portal circuit. I will mention that the inferior mesenteric vein coming up and joining with the splenic vein is the most common pattern that we see, but it's not necessarily the only one. Once again, there's variation in human anatomy, and so it's quite possible to see these three vessels fused together all in one place. So in other words, they all three come together in one spot. I've even seen some cadavers where the inferior mesenteric vein is actually fusing with the superior mesenteric vein, and then they fuse with the splenic to create the hepatic portal. So there are quite a few possibilities in terms of how these vessels fuse together, but this pattern is the most common one and the one you'll normally see in most textbooks. Okay, so once again, I recommend that you memorize this roadmap for the veins. Have it in your head so that you can use it as you look at actual models and or diagrams. Here's the book's representation of what we just looked at. Once again, we see the inferior vena cava poking through the diaphragm. The major vessels we see first are those hepatic veins, which come right off the back of the liver. So notice the liver's been removed here so as to expose these vessels. As we come down on the right side, we see a suprarenal vein draining the adrenal gland, a renal vein draining the kidney, and again a gonadal vein draining the gonad, again, be it the testicle or the ovary. Remember, on the left side, we have the same three vessels, but once again, it's asymmetrical. So the suprarenal vein and the gonadal vein do not empty into the vena cava directly, but instead they fuse with the renal vein coming from the left kidney, and together all that blood flows into the inferior vena cava. Once again, we have some other veins here that we're not mentioning. Again, we're just looking at the major vessels of the abdominal circulation. All right, once again, we've got several organs missing in terms of their drainage because of the portal circuit. So we're going to need to take a look at that portal circuit. Before we do that, I just wanted to show you one picture of a cadaver very quickly, just so you can see in the cadaver the difference between an artery and a vein. So this, for instance, is the renal vein. This right here is the abdominal aorta that's giving rise to the two common iliac arteries. And I don't know if you can notice, usually veins are a little bit darker, but that's not the most noticeable difference. The most notable difference is that arteries tend to retain their hollow or their circular diameter even when empty of blood. In other words, they don't collapse. Almost like macaroni, they stay open, they retain their circular cross-sectional profile. Veins, on the other hand, because their walls are relatively thinner, tend to collapse. And so this vein, this renal vein, for instance, doesn't look like a piece of macaroni. It actually just looks like a flattened out sheet. And that's the main difference between an artery and a vein. And of course, the vena cava shown here being a very large, flat vessel sitting right next to the aorta. Okay, so what about this portal circulation? Again, we've got essentially a splenic vein here coming in from the spleen. It sits just underneath the stomach. And as it comes in, it's going to be picking up blood also from the pancreas and from the stomach. The stomach has its own drainage into the portal vein as well. So the splenic vein is not the only vessel that drains the stomach. It's just one vessel that drains the stomach. Coming up from below, we have a superior mesenteric vein. Superior mesenteric vein draining, again, the small intestines and the large intestine through the transverse colon that's going to come up and join with the splenic vein to create the hepatic portal vein. We also have an inferior mesenteric vein which drains the distal part of the colon, and again the most common pattern is for that inferior mesenteric vein to come up and join with the splenic vein coming in from the spleen and then fusing with the superior mesenteric to make the hepatic portal vein. Okay, so that's it in terms of the vessels that we're responsible for. As I said, there is a second video that I'll be posting along with this one today, and it will be a video of several of our models that show different views of these different vessels. So I will see you on that next video. Until then, have a good day and see you soon.